All right, settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a warm beverage, or don't, whatever feels right for you. Tonight, we're going to ease into one of those delightfully peculiar corners of history. A story so utterly bonkers, it sounds like something I dreamt up after too much chamomile tea. We're talking, of course, about the time Australia declared war on a bunch of big birds. Yes, you heard that right. Not a metaphor, not a cheeky analogy, but an actual, honest-to-goodness military operation against emus. So, lean back, relax, and let's dive into the glorious, sleepy tale of the Great Emu War of 1932. So, we find ourselves, as so often we do in these narratives, in the aftermath of a rather unpleasant global unpleasantness. It's 1932, the Great Depression is humming along quite nicely, thank you very much, and everyone is feeling a bit stretched, especially our friends down under in Western Australia. Now, Western Australia, for those unfamiliar, is quite vast and rather empty in places, which, as it turns out, is excellent news for emus. Emus, for the uninitiated, are large, flightless birds native to Australia. They're kind of like ostriches, but with a more punk rock haircut and a general air of, I dare you to try and stop me. And, crucially for our story, they are incredibly good at breeding, like really, really good, which under normal circumstances is just nature doing its thing. But these were not normal circumstances. See, after World War I, the Australian government, in an entirely understandable effort to help returning soldiers, encouraged them to take up farming, specifically wheat farming, in Western Australia, in the Campion district to be precise. These ex-servicemen, many of whom had seen horrors untold in the trenches of Europe, were promised a new life, a peaceful existence tilling the land, a fresh start. They were given land, loans, and presumably a hearty pat on the back. What they weren't given, apparently, was a heads up about the local wildlife. Now, these soldiers, bless their hearts, set about turning vast tracts of bushland into wheat fields, a monumental task, no doubt, and for a while, things were okay. Then came the dry season, and then came the emus, lots and lots of emus. Estimates vary, but we're talking about something in the neighborhood of 20,000 birds. 20,000 large, hungry, and remarkably stubborn birds, all eyeing up the freshly sown wheat fields as the world's most convenient, all-you-can-eat buffet. Imagine the scene. You've just spent months, maybe years, clearing land, planting your crops, pouring your hopes and dreams into this new life, only for a veritable feathered army to descend upon it with the sole intention of eating every single grain. It would be, shall we say, a touch frustrating. And it wasn't just a few rogue emus. These were migratory patterns, massive herds moving through, leaving a trail of agricultural devastation in their wake. They were, in essence, behaving like giant feathery locusts, only with more powerful legs and a distinct lack of interest in biblical plagues. They just wanted wheat. The farmers, naturally, were not thrilled. They tried fences, scarecrows, yelling, probably shaking their fists at the sky, the usual array of tactics one employs when dealing with a relentless, non-reasoning adversary. But emus, as we're about to learn, are remarkably resilient and seem to possess an almost supernatural ability to ignore human inconvenience. They just find a weak spot in the fence, or, if feeling particularly bold, just run right through it. Because why not? It's just a fence. These farmers, many of whom were still struggling with the economic realities of the Depression, were facing financial ruin. Their pleas to the local government started to grow louder and more desperate. Something had to be done. This wasn't just a pest problem, this was an ecological and economic crisis unfolding in slow motion, one wheat stalk at a time. The emus, in their innocent pursuit of sustenance, had become public enemy number one. So, the Western Australian government, probably scratching its head and wondering how it had arrived at this particular juncture, decided to appeal to the big guns, the federal government. They asked for military assistance. Yes, you heard me correctly. They asked for the military to come and deal with some birds. It sounds utterly absurd, of course, but put yourself in their shoes. What else were they supposed to do? The emus were winning. They were undeniably, emphatically winning. And so the wheels of bureaucracy, ever so slowly, began to turn, setting the stage for one of history's most delightfully ignominious conflicts. The stage was set, the players were ready, and the emus were blissfully unaware that they were about to become protagonists in a war they couldn't possibly comprehend. The Minister of Defense at the time was Sir George Pierce. Now, Sir George was a rather interesting character. He had a long and distinguished career in politics, rising from a working-class background. He'd seen a lot, done a lot, and now he was faced with the prospect of sending soldiers to fight birds. But Sir George, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity, not just to help the farmers, but also to make a bit of a PR splash, and perhaps to demonstrate the effectiveness of new military technologies, specifically machine guns. Oh yes, this was going to be a proper military operation, not just a few blokes with shotguns. We're talking about actual soldiers, actual military vehicles, and actual machine guns. Because when faced with an existential threat from large flightless birds, what else would you use? It makes perfect sense in a very specific, slightly unhinged way. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Deploy soldiers with Lewis automatic machine guns, herd the emus into a kill zone, and then, well, you can imagine the rest. The idea was that the machine guns would be devastatingly effective against such a large, relatively slow-moving target. What could possibly go wrong? So, in November of 1932, a small contingent of soldiers from the Royal Australian Artillery was dispatched to the Campion district, and leading this intrepid force was Major G.P.W. Meredith. Major Meredith, a man who probably thought his military career would involve more traditional adversaries, was now tasked with leading an offensive against Australia's national bird. One can only imagine the conversations he had with his superiors. "Sir, the emus are, well, they're just being emus, sir." "Yes, Major, but there are wheat-eating emus now." The unit consisted of Major G.P.W. Meredith, Sergeant S. McMurray, and Gunner J. O'Halloran, a small elite team ready to tackle the feathered menace. They were armed with 2 Lewis automatic machine guns and approximately 10,000 rounds of ammunition. 10,000 rounds for emus. It's truly magnificent in its sheer over-the-topness. And they had a truck, because of course, you need a way to transport your machine guns and ammunition when you're going emu hunting. The arrival of the military contingent was met with a mix of relief and, one can only assume, a fair bit of bewildered amusement by the local farmers. Finally, help had arrived. The cavalry, or rather the infantry with machine guns, was here. The battle lines were drawn, man versus bird, technology versus raw, feathered persistence. The plan was, as initially conceived, to drive the emus into ambushes. This involved using the farmers and their vehicles to herd the birds towards the waiting machine guns. A classic pincer movement, if you will, but with a lot more dust and a lot more squawking. What they hadn't quite accounted for, however, was the emus' rather impressive tactical acumen. You see, emus might not be rocket scientists, but they're not entirely without survival instincts, and one of their most effective survival instincts is simply to scatter when threatened. They don't form neat formations, they don't charge headlong into danger, and they certainly don't stand still enough to be politely mown down by a machine gun. They zig, they zag, they dart, they run, and they can run quite fast, up to 30 miles per hour, which is pretty speedy when you're trying to aim a heavy machine gun from a moving truck or even just set up a static ambush. So, on the very first day of the operation, November 2nd, 1932, the military made its initial move. The soldiers tried to herd a large group of emus. They spotted about 50 birds, and with the assistance of local farmers, attempted to maneuver them into a good position for a machine gun volley. This proved almost immediately to be more difficult than anticipated. The emus, displaying a surprising level of battlefield awareness, decided that standing still was for amateurs. As soon as the machine guns opened fire, they scattered like billiard balls across a green felt table. Major Meredith later reported that the emus split into small groups, making them incredibly difficult to target effectively. It was less like shooting fish in a barrel and more like trying to catch smoke with a sieve. They managed to kill a few birds that day, but it was far from the decisive victory they had envisioned. The vast majority of the emus simply ran away, living to eat wheat another day. The soldiers were left with the dawning realization that these weren't just dumb birds, these were formidable adversaries, masters of guerrilla warfare, feathered ninjas of the Australian outback. The next few days didn't fare much better. The tactics remained largely the same: try to herd, fail to herd, fire a lot of bullets, kill a few birds, watch the rest disappear over the horizon. The machine guns, designed for human targets, were proving to be remarkably ineffective against these agile, scattering creatures. It was like trying to swat flies with a sledgehammer, theoretically powerful but practically useless. Major Meredith, in his reports, began to paint a picture of a frustrating, almost comical struggle. He noted the emu's ability to break ranks and run in unpredictable patterns. He observed their surprising hardiness, often taking multiple hits and still managing to keep going. It was becoming clear that the emu was to not be underestimated. One particular incident stands out, recounted by a soldier involved in the operation. They had managed to position a machine gun on the back of a truck. Secondly, the emus once again showed their remarkable ability to adapt. They would run parallel to the truck just out of effective range, or suddenly veer off, forcing the truck to slow down or risk overturning. It was a high-speed chase, but with the quarry having an irritating habit of being just that little bit faster, just that little bit smarter. After a week of this, on November 8th, Major Meredith filed a report that was, to put it mildly, less than glowing. He noted that the emus were now dispersing into smaller and smaller groups, making them even harder to target. The initial estimates of kills were around 300 birds, using approximately 2,500 rounds of ammunition. That's a kill ratio of roughly 8 rounds per bird, which for a machine gun is not exactly a ringing endorsement of its efficiency. And this was only after a week. The operation was quickly becoming a laughingstock, both locally and internationally. News of Australia's Emu War was starting to trickle out, much to the amusement of newspaper readers around the world. Imagine reading that headline in London or New York: "Australian Army fails to defeat birds." It's not exactly inspiring confidence in your military prowess, is it? The farmers, who had initially been so hopeful, were growing disillusioned. The military intervention, while well-intentioned, was simply not working. The emus were still there, still eating their wheat, and now they were probably a bit more wary of large, noisy vehicles. Sir George Pierce, the Minister of Defense who had championed this whole endeavor, was now finding himself in an increasingly awkward position. The media, never one to miss an opportunity for a good chuckle, was having a field day. Caricatures of soldiers fighting giant birds, headlines mocking the Emu War. It was all a bit embarrassing. The whole point of the exercise was partly PR, to show the government was doing something and to test out new machine guns. Instead, it was doing the exact opposite. So, on November 8th, just 6 days after it began, the first phase of the Emu War was effectively called off. Major Meredith and his men were recalled. The official reason was that there were no worthwhile concentrations of emus, which, of course, was a polite way of saying, we couldn't hit them, they ran away, and this is costing us a fortune in ammunition for very little return. The emus had, in a sense, won the first round. A decisive, if somewhat confusing, victory for the feathered insurgents. The soldiers, presumably, returned to their barracks, perhaps a little sheepish, perhaps a little amused themselves. They had fought the good fight, but against an enemy that simply refused to play by the rules of conventional warfare. The machine guns, so effective against static targets, were flummoxed by the erratic, unpredictable movements of thousands of terrified birds. But this wasn't the end of the story, of course. History, like a particularly stubborn emu, has a habit of doubling down. The farmers were still facing ruin, the emus were still eating their wheat, and the Australian government was still looking rather silly. The war might have been paused, but the underlying conflict remained. And so, like any good sequel, there would be a second act. But for now, let's just allow the image of a bewildered Major Meredith watching thousands of emus simply run away to settle in. It's a testament to nature's quiet defiance, isn't it? A gentle reminder that sometimes even the most advanced technology can be outsmarted by a bird with a strong will and a love for wheat. So after that first, rather embarrassing withdrawal, you'd think the Australian government would have taken the hint, maybe tried a very large fence, or perhaps some particularly aggressive scarecrows? But no, because in the world of 1930s bureaucracy, if at first you don't succeed with machine guns, the only logical answer is to try more machine guns. Part 2. The Empire Strikes Back, with more bullets. The retreat of Major Meredith's little troop didn't exactly sit well with the farmers. While the rest of the world was busy giggling into their morning coffee about the Great Emu War, the veterans turned farmers in the Campion district were watching their livelihoods literally walk away in the stomachs of 20,000 birds. The heat was relentless, the depression was biting, and the emus, well, the emus were emboldened. They hadn't just survived a military encounter, they'd basically won. The Premier of Western Australia, James Mitchell, found himself in a bit of a pickle. He had a mob of angry, armed farmers. Remember, these guys were WW1 vets, threatening to take matters into their own hands, and an angry veteran with a grudge and a rifle is generally something a politician wants to avoid. So Mitchell went back to the federal government, essentially saying, look, the birds are back, the farmers are furious, and our national dignity is currently being trampled by flightless poultry. Send the major back. Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defense, who is now being jokingly referred to in Parliament as the Minister of the Emu War, initially hesitated. But then the reports started coming in. The emus weren't just eating the wheat, they were destroying the fences. And when the fences went down, the rabbits moved in. It was a multi-layered ecological catastrophe. So, on November 12, 1932, the order was given. The military was going back in. Major Meredith was once again summoned. I like to imagine him sighing, looking at his Lewis guns, and wondering if he could just trade them in for a very large butterfly net. But being a professional, he gathered Sergeant McMurray and Gunner O'Halloran, hopped back in the truck, and headed back to the front lines. This time, they were determined to be more efficient. The second phase of the operation began on November 13th, and right out of the gate, things were slightly more successful. Perhaps the emus had grown complacent, perhaps the soldiers had finally figured out the leading distance required to hit a sprinting bird from a bouncing flatbed. Whatever the reason, the first couple of days yielded better results. They were picking off about 40 or 50 birds a day. But then, the emus did something truly remarkable. They adapted. Again. Major Meredith noted in his diary, with a level of respect that borders on the poetic, that the emus seemed to have developed a command structure. He observed that in each large mob, there would be one giant black-feathered male who stood nearly 6 feet tall. This commander would stand perfectly still, watching the soldiers, while the rest of the mob feasted on the wheat. The moment a soldier moved or a truck started up, the commander would give a signal, a sort of low, grunting warning, and the entire mob would scatter in different directions. The leader would remain until his troops were safe. Then he'd calmly trot off himself. It was guerrilla warfare, plain and simple. The emus had essentially invented the lookout system. They were splitting into smaller groups, ensuring that a single burst of machine gun fire could only ever take out 1 or 2 birds at most. It was an incredibly expensive way to hunt. At one point, Meredith remarked that if they had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, they'd face any army in the world. He was quite literally being outmaneuvered by a creature with a brain the size of a walnut. By mid-November, the frustration was reaching a boiling point. The soldiers tried to mount a Lewis gun on a truck to chase the birds down, but the terrain was their undoing. The ground was so uneven that the gunner couldn't aim, and the driver was too busy trying not to snap the axle to actually close the gap. In one particularly tragic comic moment, the truck actually managed to get close to a mob, but then crashed into a fence, and a stray emu got caught in the steering wheel, causing the whole thing to veer off into a ditch. You couldn't write this stuff. It's like a slapstick comedy where the stakes are the national food supply. The sheer durability of the emus was becoming a legend. One soldier claimed to have hit an emu multiple times, only for the bird to keep running like nothing had happened. They were described as being built like tanks. The Lewis gun's .303 rounds, which were designed to stop charging infantry in the mud of France, were seemingly being absorbed by the emu's thick feathers and dense muscle. It was a war of attrition, and the emus had more recruits than the army had bullets. Despite the hurdles, Meredith stayed in the field until December. The government was desperate for some kind of victory to report. By the time he was finally recalled on December 10th, the official report claimed that 986 emus had been killed with 9,960 rounds. Let's just pause there and do the math. Exactly 10 bullets for every one bird. Now, in the world of military statistics, that's actually not that bad for a machine gun, but in the context of hunting pests, it was an absolute fiscal nightmare. Meredith also claimed that about 2,500 additional birds had died of their wounds later, but that felt like a student claiming they technically got an A because they studied hard. The war was over. The military withdrew for the final time. Major Meredith went back to his regular duties, hopefully far away from anything with feathers. Sir George Pierce faced a barrage of mockery in the Senate, where one member asked if medals would be struck for the campaign, and another suggested that the emus should be given the Victoria Cross for their brave defense of their territory. But here's the kicker. The emus didn't leave. The soldiers were gone, the machine guns were silent, and the wheat was still delicious. The farmers continued to beg for help in 1934, 1943, and 1948, but the government, having learned its lesson about the optics of losing to a bird twice, politely declined to send the army back. Instead, they eventually settled on a much more effective, if less cinematic solution, a bounty system. It turns out, if you tell local farmers they'll pay you for every emu they handle themselves, they're much better at it than the Royal Australian Artillery. In 1934 alone, over 57,000 bounties were claimed. No machine guns, no trucks, no international headlines, just a lot of very determined farmers with shotguns. The Great Emu War remains this beautiful, dusty asterisk in history. It's a story about the limits of technology, the stubbornness of nature, and the sheer absurdity that happens when humans try to impose order on a landscape they don't quite understand. The emu, of course, is still on the Australian coat of arms, standing tall next to the kangaroo. Some say it's because they can't walk backward, symbolizing a nation moving forward. But given what happened in 1932, I like to think it's a subtle nod to the fact that they're the only animal to ever win a war against the Australian government. So, as we finish our little journey through the scrublands of Western Australia, take a deep breath. The dust has settled, the Lewis guns are tucked away in museums, and the emus are probably out there somewhere, right now, eyeing a wheat field and waiting for their next commander to give the signal. Well, we've seen the dust settle on the plains of Western Australia, and while the emus are currently enjoying their hard-won victory, history is never short on people making questionable decisions with a high degree of confidence. Since we've explored the dysfunctional side of nature, let's float over to another royal disaster, one that involves a very specific kind of dynastic weirdness. If the emus were the masters of the outback, our next subjects were the masters of the European palace, at least until their family tree became a straight line. Now, if you're tucked in and comfortable, let's talk about the Habsburgs, specifically the Spanish branch. You know the ones. They were the most powerful family in the world for a while, ruling over an empire where the sun never set. Which is ironic because by the end of it, they were struggling to even keep their eyes open. The Habsburgs had a motto: let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did. They married their cousins, their nieces, their second cousins, and then, just to be safe, they married those cousins again. It was a strategy designed to keep land and power within the family, but as it turns out, biology doesn't really care about your real estate portfolio. We have to start with the most famous face of this genetic experiment, Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. He was born in 1661, and from the moment he arrived, it was clear that the Habsburg luck had finally run out. He was the result of generations of what we might politely call focused breeding. To give you an idea of the math, a normal person has 32 great-great-great-grandparents. Charles, he only had 10. His mother was also his father's niece. His grandmother was also his aunt. It's the kind of family tree that doesn't branch out so much as it just folds back in on itself like a very sad pretzel. Charles was known as El Hechizazo, or The Bewitched, because people at the time literally couldn't believe a human being could be so unlucky without the help of a dark curse. But it wasn't a curse, it was just the DNA bill coming due. He was famous for the Habsburg jaw, a lower mandible so pronounced and heavy that he couldn't actually chew his food. He just sort of swallowed things whole, which I suppose is one way to save time at dinner, but it's not exactly the pinnacle of royal grace. His tongue was so large that he could barely speak, and when he did, he drooled quite a bit. He didn't even learn to walk until he was 4, and he wasn't expected to live past his 10th birthday. Yet, against all odds, Charles lived until he was 38. And for those 38 years, the entire world sat around, staring at him, waiting for him to die so they could grab his stuff. It's a bit tragic, really. He was a king who couldn't eat, couldn't speak clearly, and was arguably the most hunted man in Europe, not by assassins, but by his own doctors and priests. The court was a strange, hushed place. Imagine being a servant there, watching this man, who looked like a half-baked potato with a crown on top, try to navigate the massive, echoing halls of the Escorial. He was sickly, he had frequent meltdowns, and he was incredibly superstitious. At one point, he became convinced that he was indeed bewitched, so he had the bodies of his ancestors exhumed so he could look at them. Because, of course, staring at your great-grandparents is the natural cure for a genetic disorder. Despite all this, Charles was reportedly quite a kind soul. He wasn't a tyrant, he was just a very tired man caught in a very broken body. He spent his days trying to please a court that was mostly interested in who would take over his throne. His wives, he had 2, were predictably miserable. His first wife, Marie-Louise, was a vibrant French princess who arrived in Spain only to realize she was married to a man who couldn't really hold a conversation and spent most of his time being purged by doctors. The pressure on Charles to produce an heir was immense. It was the only job he had. But, as you might expect, a man whose DNA was essentially a photocopy of a photocopy was not particularly fertile. When he finally passed away in 1700, the autopsy report, which is a masterpiece of dry historical horror, claimed that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, and his head was full of water. It's a miracle he was standing at all, let alone ruling. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, sparking a massive war across Europe. All that careful marrying to keep the land together ended up causing the very thing they feared, the land being torn apart by everyone else. But the Habsburgs weren't the only ones playing this game. If we float across the English Channel, we find a different kind of royal dysfunction. While the Habsburgs were doubling down on Jaws, the British royals were focusing on, well, being exceptionally grumpy and having very public emotional meltdowns. Take George III, for instance. Poor George. He's usually remembered as the mad king who lost America, but he was actually a very dedicated, if somewhat obsessive, farmer king who just happened to have a metabolic disorder called porphyria. Or maybe it was bipolar disorder, or maybe it was just the stress of having children who were, quite frankly, a bit of a nightmare. George had 15 children. 15! And you'd think with that many chances, at least one of them would be a standard run-of-the-mill success. But no, his sons, the royal dukes, were a collection of spendthrifts, gamblers, and general nuisances. They were the original spoiled royals. They ran up massive debts, lived with mistresses while refusing to marry for dynastic reasons, and generally gave their father a headache that lasted several decades. George's bouts of madness involved him talking until he foamed at the mouth, or mistaking a tree for the King of Prussia and trying to have a polite conversation with it. It's a very gentle sort of chaos. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, he was just lost in a very loud, very busy internal world. And the doctors at the time, bless them, decided the best way to help was to wrap him in straitjackets and give him arsenic-based medicines. The contrast is quite striking, isn't it? In Spain, you have the silent, drooping tragedy of Charles II. In England, you have the loud, frantic energy of George III. Both were men trapped by their roles and their biology, surrounded by people who were more interested in the crown than the person wearing it. It makes you appreciate the quiet life, doesn't it? No one is checking my heart to see if it's the size of a peppercorn. No one is waiting for me to talk to a tree so they can start a continental war. We're just here, in the dark, listening to the echoes of people who had too much power and not enough genetic variety. As we drift toward the end of this part, maybe think about your own family tree. Be grateful for every branch that goes somewhere new. Be grateful that your chin is exactly where it's supposed to be.